And welcome everybody to this edition of the O'Hara News and Editorial on this June 2nd, 2015. We have a very special show tonight. We have a very special guest, as always. Justin Trottier, who has joined us before in the past several times, is joining us tonight, and always we're looking forward towards a really good show. There's a lot of things happening up there in Canada with Cafe, as always. One of my favorite men's rights groups. I think they, more than a lot of people, have really proven that men's rights activism can work, despite what a lot of people say. And I always get very frustrated about that. But he's here tonight with us, and we're going to be talking about their participation in the Toronto Gay Pride Parade, and also about their opening of their new Ottawa branch, which will open tomorrow, Wednesday, which I'm sure that Justin's very excited about, as well as myself. Justin, how are you doing tonight?
I'm very well. Thanks so much for having me on.
Great. Thanks a lot for coming on tonight. It's really always a pleasure to have you on. Always. I'm going to go, since this has been in the news lately, I'm going to go ahead and start with the Gay Pride event that you all are hoping to participate in Toronto, which is where you live, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So you're heavily involved in this, I assume. And of course, this went on last year. Now, you all last year, you guys were not allowed to participate. Is that correct?
That's true, although in 2013 we were able to participate. And in fact, that was the year that we hosted Dr. Warren Farrell, that we hosted
Right.
Domingo. We had some really provocative, contentious events, and yet Pride had no problem with us walking. I think what happened in 2014 was that a very small but very loud group of radicals opposed to our participation was able to basically co-opt the Pride bureaucracy to do their bidding. And what that meant was that we were unable to even mount, a case in defense of our participation. Now, we're hoping that this year we won't have that trouble again, that we will be able to respond to some of the concerns that people have put forward. And I think if we have that ability, we will be able to deal with some of the allegations that have been put out against us again.
Okay, do you think these people got together in response to your provocative actions at the University of Toronto with Dr. Warren Farrell, and some other activities you guys were involved with, especially on college campuses? Do you think this was a retaliation last year, or a way to say, wait a minute, these guys are getting a bit too big for us, they're getting a bit too high profile, we can't have them in the parade because, oh, heaven forbid, they're actually becoming an effective movement now? Do you think that was...
What's interesting is that, of course, the Warren Farrell event and the events that followed got a lot of attention.
Right.
But then that response in the form of a law-breaking riot, it kind of died down for a while. We did a lot of events that really went well covered by the mainstream press, but not attracting that kind of protest or riot. And then it was right around the time we got charity status. And I think this was seen by some of our opponents as one step too far in terms of
Yep.
mainstreaming or normalizing, and we don't call it men's rights activism. Our approach is, men's issues, men's health. So that's how we got charitable status, was that we have built an organization that isn't ideological, isn't committed to one label or another, but is simply about improving the health and welfare of men. And we work with anybody who's interested, regardless of the label or the ideology that they choose for themselves. And that has been, I think, a positive approach, and that is the reason why we were, granted charitable status. We were found to be in the public interest in Canada, and I think that was anathema to a lot of our opponents. The idea that advocating for the health and welfare of men could be deemed by the government as in the public interest, and that's what really fueled the fire right around the time of Pride. And the timing was coincidental, but it sort of worked to our disadvantage in that as soon as they decided that they wanted to make trouble for us because of the charity status, there was the Pride that was right around the corner, and they decided that was the focus of their attention.
Well, I was thinking about this today, the whole charity status, and you guys actually got money from the Canadian government, right?
Not directly, but as a charity, we do enjoy indirect subsidies, and tax receipts to donors. But no, this is an important point. Today we've exclusively been operating on private donations, almost entirely from individual private donations just from hundreds of people that support our men's health and welfare initiatives.
Well, it just seems to me that this is the sacred ground of your opponents. This government validation, whether it be through the form of subsidization or actually government grants, that this is something that to them, as you said, is an anathema. Once you get that status, you become a threat to them, because to them it's kind of a zero-sum game. It's like, wait a minute, they're taking our money. I mean, literally, that's how they think about it.
That's exactly it. And when we have been active recently asking that Ontario build the first, and if it were built, it would be the only domestic violence shelter dedicated to men and fathers who are fleeing domestic abuse environments in homes in Ontario, have no place to go with their children. We think that's unacceptable, and we've been putting up billboards. We have been presenting to government committees about the need to open a single domestic violence shelter for men. And the way that's perceived by radicals on the other side is that one domestic abuse shelter for men is one too many, because it otherwise would have been another shelter for women. It's exactly that zero-sum game, that you are either, supporting women's services or men's services. And there seems to be this unsophisticated, failure to understand that when you support any innocent people who are suffering, you're actually making families and communities stronger, and everybody benefits from that.
Right. Well, I wanted to bring up this article in the Daily Extra, which seems to be kind of the favorite article to be cited about this whole you're participating in gay pride. Again, the Daily Extra. It was published on May 27th by H.G. Watson. It's titled "Toronto's Men's Rights Group Plans to March in Gay Pride Parade." I'm going to read this article, and it's a short article, but I wanted to kind of get your reaction to the reaction of the folks opposing you. The controversial men's rights group Canadian Association for Equality, CAFE, plans on marching in the 2015 Toronto Pride Parade, barring any major complaints. Pride Toronto Executive Director Matthew Chantilios confirmed to Daily Extra that the group is included on the list of over 250 groups marching this year. So far, they're on the list. Chantilios says, all groups that applied to march in the parade were approved this year. Quote, everybody is approved until we get a complaint against them, Chantilios says. Any member of the public who objects to the participation of any of the groups can make a confidential complaint through Pride Toronto's dispute resolution process. I'm not too familiar with the work that CAFE does, but obviously if there is some concern by anybody in the community, we will take them extremely seriously. He said, in 2014, CAFE's permit to march in the World Pride Parade was revoked by Pride Toronto. Pride staff sent a letter to the groups explaining that their work may, quote, contravene the spirit of the mission, vision, and values of Pride Toronto and World Pride. CAFE's executive director, Justin Trottier, says that Pride is an important event for the organization. Quote, marching in Pride has always been a priority. He insists that the group is a human rights organization. Quote, we're interested in the health and welfare of men and boys, Trottier says. Quote, there's nothing in that remotely contravenes Pride. CAFE is widely considered to be a men's rights organization by many members of the community and media. It's brought at least one well-known men's rights speaker to Toronto. Most recently, it courted controversy after purchasing a billboard on Davenport Road claiming that half of domestic violence victims are men, citing information from a 2009 Statistics Canada report. However, in response in the Globe and Mail, writer Lee McLaren points out that, quote, according to the same study, women are 3 times as likely to be victims of serious violence. The group was subject to further criticism when, despite having its permit revoked, members walked in the World Pride Parade by joining the group from the Sherbourne Health Center. Staff from the Sherbourne Health Center later told Daily Extra that CAFE members had not been clear about why their permit was revoked, and that they, quote, unequivocally did not endorse or support CAFE. Trottier says that there will be no issues this year as long as Pride Toronto honors its commitment to use the dispute resolution process. Trottier alleges that the organization did not do so in 2014 when their permit was revoked. Pride robbed us of the opportunity to have a meaningful conversation about why we wanted to walk, what we would bring to the parade, and answer any concerns they might have. If there are specific concerns people have, we will be happy to respond to them, Trottier adds. So, about this, Leah McLaren, what her issues were with your assertion that half of all victims of domestic violence were men, and that she said, according to the same study, women are 3 times as likely to be victims of serious violence. What's your response to that? Just as a start off, we're going to talk a bit more about some other things.
Well, there's a lot in that extra article that requires some analysis and interpretation. In terms of the response to the Violence Against Men billboard campaign, I mean, you'll notice that nobody actually refutes the claim we made. There's a lot of things that can be said about domestic violence. It's
Right.
certainly not a simple issue. It's not as simple as radicals on any side make it out to be, including radical feminists, I might say. The claim that we made, though, half of domestic violence victims are men, we provided no less than 7 sources that all mutually reinforce that claim. Statistics Canada is the main one because every 10 years the Canadian government requires a high percentage of Canadian households to answer these questions. So no other survey gets as much data as that one. So it's the most comprehensive and the most accurate. But we cited 6 other studies, some of which were also government studies, some of which were done by sociologists who have researched this issue of gender and violence. We provided a meta-study, a meta-analysis of hundreds of other studies. All of them show and reinforce the fact that half of domestic violence is suffered by men and half is suffered by women. And even in this particular extra article, the concern that was stated didn't refute that fact. It presented a different fact. It presented a fact that had to do with, another issue related to violence, an important issue about the severity of violence. And by the way, the jury is out on that. We also deal with this on our website where we present conflicting studies, some of which show that women are indeed suffering, more severe kinds of violence, but other studies show that though women are on average less physically strong than men, they make up for that by using weapons more often.
Right, yeah, I wanted to add to that, yeah.
There's a lively debate on that issue, but the point is that's a different issue. That has nothing to do with the issue that we put forward. So if you want to claim that our campaign, put forward a falsity, show me a statistic that rebukes the point that was made in the billboard, and there were 2 points that were made. One, that rates of violence are comparable, and again, 7 different studies that reinforce that. And the second one, which they never talk about, because it's even more well established, that there are precisely 0 shelters for abused men. And it's the fact that it's that contradiction that there are thousands and thousands of male victims, whether it's 50% or it's only 25%, that's still thousands and thousands of victims, and there are 0 beds for these victims. That is the big point that we were trying to make with that billboard campaign. And very often our opponents will present other facts that were not part of the billboard communication, as though that somehow dismisses the main point of the campaign, which is this gross gap in services for men and boys.
Okay, back to the article again. I wanted to talk about, because they kind of in an oblique manner skirted around why you were barred from participating last year. Apparently the organizer this year says he's not terribly familiar with Cafe's work. I don't know, is it the same director as last year? The director of the Pride Parade?
Director, and to be fair to him, he has shown every indication that he is in fact committed to following the rules and the policies, whereas his predecessor really couldn't care less about those policies. In fact, the dispute resolution procedure requires that any dispute be settled within a week before the parade, that it's just wrong suddenly out of the blue cancel a permit 3 days before the parade. So this year we have a different director. I have spoken with him. I had warned him that we would be applying. I had told him, do not throw this on us at the last minute. If there are concerns, let's do this properly. Let's do this in sophisticated, civilized way with a proper dialogue, and he has been following the rules. So I have to give him credit for that.
That's great. That's actually great news. And kudos to him, seriously. But what the actual rule that says the complaints have to be resolved within a certain period of time. You said 2 weeks, right?
I think it's within a week of
Within a week.
the
Okay.
actual parade, which means that you have to start the process, weeks in advance.
And if you're not able to start it weeks in advance, if you're not able to get a resolution, then the applicant can participate in the parade. Is that my understanding? Is that the
Yeah,
correct
that's
understanding?
exactly what it is. Because if you think about it, what would otherwise happen, and what in fact, of course, did happen to us, is opponents of an organization walking in the parade will simply wait until the last minute and then
Right.
present their case and make it impossible for the procedure to be followed. And
Right.
of course, what Pride did was they basically said, well, we don't have to follow the procedure because Cafe is such an egregious violator of the
Right.
principles of the parade that it's okay for us to invoke sort of an emergency clause and just dismiss you summarily without any fair consideration. And notice the language that they use. It's come to our attention that Cafe may be in violation of the spirit of the parade. Not we've
Right.
looked at this and we've decided that
Right.
you are. Just you may be because some random person said so. That's
Did,
all.
did no? Did I never got a chance to interview you about what happened last year. But what specific issues did they cite as making you in violation of the values and spirit of gay pride in
Well,
Toronto?
understand the context here. We were notified of the revocation of our permit 3 days before the actual parade,
Right.
and we were not invited to dispute it. It was just a fait accompli. What I had to do was I had to use the fact that I happened to know last year's executive director
Uh,
from other networks that we happen to be in sort of in common organizational networks, and so I was able to get his cell phone number, and I just cold called
oh,
the guy like that
nice.
night, and I said, what gives? Can we at least meet you and talk about this and do this properly? And he did agree to that, and we actually met him. I think it was within 24 hours of that original notice that we had our permit revoked. He gave us about 45 minutes of his time, which I guess was gracious,
Uh,
and he sort of threw out just a couple of random things based on what was on the top of his head. So we never really got like a full accounting of what the concerns were, but they were, very typical things. It's well known that we're a misogynist men's rights group. It's well
right.
known that we have these nefarious affiliations with all of these extreme groups. It's well known that our events, this is a good one, our events have created dangerous places on campus. Of course, those dangerous places have been the result of a law-breaking riot that has come to the events. Not that we have, created these riots, but they have come to the events. And then, of course, we get
Right.
blamed for then creating this dangerous place on campus. So all of these rumors and other things that would, be rightly described as slander, what was all sort of thrown at us, and we were given like 30 to 45 minutes to explain ourselves, and that was the only chance that we had. And then the next day I get an email from the same guy saying, well, thank you for meeting, but I've decided I'm not gonna change my mind. And then what he did say was, go find another group to walk with. And what's interesting is, so we did exactly that. We ended up walking with the Sherborne Health Agency, which is a LGBT healthcare organization in Toronto, which we're connected with because a number of our members are members of the LGBT community, including the chair of our LGBT committee, our cafe committee, who is herself a transgendered woman. She connected us with Sherborne Health Center. We walked with them wearing their shirts, but proudly declaring that we were cafe members supporting Sherborne Health. And then the next day we read in the paper that this was cafe connivingly joining the Pride Parade, even though we had been the executive director. You can't walk as a group, but individual members are welcome to find other groups to walk with. We did exactly that because it meant a lot to us to be part of Pride, even if we couldn't do it as an organization. And somehow that was also used against us. So we really can't win no matter what we do.
didn't have my microphone on. If you could, please, in your own words, please tell us why it is so important for Cafe to join Pride, the Pride Parade in Toronto.
Pride is a celebration of tolerance and inclusion and acceptance, and those are the values of Cafe. And I used to say that Cafe was Cafe's values were consistent with the values of the gay rights movement, were consistent with the values of the women's movement, were consistent with the values of the environmental movement. But I'd go a step further. I would say, Cafe is actually led by gay and straight people. Cafe is led by men and women. There's a sense that a lot of people have of our organization that we are a bunch of old white men. And from time to time, we say these platitudes about our commitment to women's rights and gay rights. That's not the correct way of looking at it. We're actually run by a diverse group of people. We are an organization of gay people and straight people and women and men. And if you look at our organization, if you look at the board of directors, if you look at who's actually providing the services, the mental health services at our men's center, if you look at who is running our campus groups, they are women and men. They are gays and straights. So for us to join the gay community in celebrating the values that should be the values both of the gay community and of the Cafe community, I think it's a no-brainer that that's a place where we need to be. And as I said, we walked in 2013 for those reasons. We wanted to walk in 2014. We were told we could not. We're going to walk every year we possibly can. And by the way, we're setting up branches in Ottawa, in Montreal, in Vancouver, and they have pride parades too. We'll be walking in all of those every chance we get because it's important. It's a priority for us.
Let's go ahead and talk about your new branch in Ottawa. Of course, you want to provide all the services that your existing branches do, but is there any kind of specific thing you want to accomplish by opening this particular branch in Ottawa? Why did you choose Ottawa as the next step? Was it because of population-wise? Is it as simple as that, or is it for other reasons?
It's for a number of reasons. Some of them are practical in the sense that Ottawa is a large population center. Ottawa has a lot of Catholic members.
Right.
Ottawa is, it's close to Toronto, and so in terms of organization and management, it's reachable in terms of the members and the leaders in Toronto assisting with the establishment of a new branch, which is only a 5-hour car ride away. But Ottawa is the national capital. Ottawa is where we have our federal House of Commons, our Supreme Court of Canada, the National Press Gallery, all of the various apparatuses of our federal government is in Ottawa. So being an organization which is at its core about men's health and men's issues and education and public awareness, but also as kind of an element of that, caring about public policy debates, this is an opportunity to be part of government committee hearings, to meet with federal politicians, to be involved perhaps even in intervening in Supreme Court cases. Eventually, that's a goal that we have as well. So it's certainly a key city for us in Canada.
Do you plan on maybe perhaps engaging in some lobbying activity?
As a charity, we have to be careful because charities, this is true of all charities, there's a certain threshold of how much of your resources, time, money, what have you can commit to lobbying activities. But lobbying, I think, is a corollary of the public awareness work that is at the core of our mandate. So yes, absolutely, whether it's provincial issues that relate to providing more services for men's health, which is a provincial government issue, or whether it has to do with the federal government, for example, the Public Health Agency of Canada, that's a federal agency, takes a very sort of radical feminist point of view when it comes to dealing with domestic violence. It sees it as a gendered issue where men are looked at merely as perpetrators of violence instead of using a more sophisticated and evidence-based approach. So that's a federal area that interests us. Yes, where appropriate, where it advances our mission to improve the health and welfare of boys, men, and fathers, we certainly will use every tool at our disposal, including lobbying and political advocacy.
Well, when you say that there are limits as to how much time and money you can spend on this, obviously you're because you're a subsidized charity, you have a certain degree of public accountability.
Yeah.
But certainly, if you get a bunch of people who are willing to volunteer their time on a specific issue that comes up in Parliament for a specific bill, the renewal of a specific bill, like here in Washington, the VAWA comes up for renewal every 5 years. Certainly you can you as a member of Cafe or any other member of Cafe can go talk to their PM in the Capitol and say, hey, here's this issue that's coming up, or there's this bill that's being renewed or proposed, and I want to talk to you about this. That kind of thing, shouldn't that be kind of unlimited, or is that not the case in Canada? Where if it's someone just of their own
the
volition.
rules are you can't spend more than 10% of your resources on what they consider political advocacy.
Okay, I see. Okay.
But the way, I don't want to get into the weeds here because it gets quite technical.
Sure.
But if you're educating politicians about men's health, if you're educating elected officials about men's issues, perspectives on things, that's not necessarily lobbying. Lobbying has a very well-defined definition. It has to do with advocating law or a particular party, and we are through and through a nonpartisan organization with a public education focus. But having said that, look, if individual volunteers want to commit their volunteer time and energy to a particular public policy issue that's important to them, well, we will certainly create committees to work on that. In fact, we've been doing that for the last couple of years. The billboard that we talked about briefly before, it wasn't only putting up this ad, it was also around the issue of violence with the chief of staff of the provincial government's community services ministry. It was meeting with the government's committee looking at sexual harassment and violence and encouraging them to include male victims of sexual violence when they come forward with anticipated new public policies around sexual violence. So we've been doing a lot of public policy work to date. Establishing a branch in the nation's capital in Ottawa means that we will be able to complement what has largely been provincial public policy advocacy with advocacy at the federal level as well.
What kind of services is the Ottawa branch going to provide? Is it you're starting off slow at first? Is it going to be a full service thing, or is it going to be kind of you're going to go step by step? How many people are going to staff the branch? Can you give us some idea of what's behind it? What's going to be available? How substantial will it be? Just to start off with, and what your goals for the future?
Well, every branch that we establish is going to follow a similar approach because it's worked quite well for us, at least in Toronto. And of course, every city has its own unique issues to deal with. But the approach that's worked for us has been public education first. So in Toronto, we established our credibility by putting on events, raising awareness, raising volunteers and donors through events that started a conversation where really there wasn't a conversation happening, and that's what we're going to do in Ottawa and in Vancouver and Montreal and other places. And then once we've established that kind of beachhead, then we will be looking at fundraising to establish an actual center. There's no physical center yet in Ottawa, only in Toronto, but I can tell you it's extremely exciting that having only been organizing our Ottawa branch for just 5 to 6 weeks, we already have an amazing group of people in terms of both quality and quantity. Our inaugural event, which will kick off a monthly lecture series, again focusing on public education first, is happening tomorrow. We have David Shackleton, who's the inaugural president of the branch, who's got an amazing pedigree. He used to publish a magazine called Everyman, which for about a decade was kind of a leading periodical in Canada talking about men's issues, back before there was so much attention on these issues, or at least relatively more attention, I should say, these days. So he's been doing this for quite a while, and he's just published a book which looks at gender and power and victimhood, and it will be the Ottawa book launch, which will be the focus of the inaugural event there in Ottawa tomorrow. And if things go well and our election gains the attention that we hope it does, and we're able to recruit members and donors, then in time, we hope that we can establish a similar center to what we have in Toronto and provide a full range of mental health programs, a legal aid clinic for fathers, an employment services.
You there, Justin?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, you cut out for a minute. I wanted to ask you. You mentioned the legal aid clinic for fathers.
Mm-hmm.
That fascinates me. In Canada, it's bad enough here in the U.S. and in other parts of the world like the U.K. and Australia and increasingly in India, but it is particularly bad in Canada for fathers, divorced fathers, who want to maintain contact with their children, and of course there's incredibly oppressive alimony laws in Canada. It's changing here in the U.S., but I don't know what the status is up there as far as alimony reform. But you say you set up a legal clinic in Toronto for fathers. What does that entail?
Now, it's not only for family law, but I should say it's that family law issues are certainly far and away the number one issue that we're dealing with. And to answer your first question, family law, with respect to how it treats fathers, is about as bad as it could get.
Right.
As bad as I've seen it in any other jurisdiction. Now, I have dozens and dozens of these men. On a weekly basis. We have a weekly legal aid program for them. But I can't imagine it getting much worse without there being a significant backlash against the kind of injustice and just gross negligence in family court, and frankly in other aspects of our legal system as it applies to men, certainly in Ontario.
Well, I remember seeing a story, it was yesterday, I believe, where a guy, he and his wife had divorced when his daughter was 2 years old. She took the girl, an alienation process started. He couldn't see the girl, and all the basic garden variety nightmare story, of course. But then she disappeared. His ex-wife disappeared with his daughter, and he never saw his daughter again after that until recently. When he found out that at the age of 12, when the girl turned 12, his wife had put her into foster care. And she lived with her foster parents until she was 18 years old. Then finally he caught up with his daughter. Somehow he used social media. He spent 16 years tracking down his daughter. It was a heartbreaking story, a harrowing story of a father trying to reconnect with his daughter. And he finally did. And she lives with him now. She's like 18, 19 years old now. But even as they were putting this kid into foster care, they never even tried to get in touch with this guy. They knew who he was. They knew who his name was. They knew how to get in touch with him, but they just didn't get in touch with the guy. They didn't say, "Hey, you want to have custody of your kid?" They didn't even try to do that. And they had the gall to send him a bill for the foster care that this girl received, for this girl being in foster care.
Now that's when they know what his address and contact information is.
Yeah, but the reason they said that they didn't contact him was because they didn't have a birth date for the guy.
Uh-huh.
It's like, excuse me. Now, like here in the U.S., there are a lot of abuses, especially in the case of paternity fraud. And men being declared fathers in absentia. It really does get bad here. It's not quite as bad as Canada, but it's pretty bad. But I've never seen anything like that happen here in the U.S. And
it gets pretty bad, and I'm probably not going to tell you any stories the likes of which you haven't heard, but maybe I can give you some cause for optimism, and that is that coming through our door every day, and people come into our door every day with horrendous stories, but we're actually getting a lot of women who are coming in that door and are there on behalf of male loved ones in their life,
right.
Whether that is sons, whether that is male friends, whether that is male partners, and these women know firsthand the injustices that these men are facing, because, in some cases, these are second wives, right? And so they know that these men that they're married to are good, decent men, that they have been fighting to regain some access to their children, and that they don't deserve what they're getting. And to me, that gives me a lot of hope, because if we're getting women on board as allies, and of course this movement has always had women in leadership roles, but seeing the extent of how far they're willing to go to fight for these men. And just today we had a volunteer who has a partner who had been taken to criminal court, had allegations made against him by his children from a previous marriage, that he was an abusive father towards them. And the fact that there was no, evidence to suggest that, the fact that the stories, there were alibis and the stories didn't make sense, none of that mattered. The police were instructed to prosecute this man to the full extent of the law. And the police even told him, we know we don't have any evidence, but our hands are tied. This is just the policy, that once there's an allegation made against you, we have no choice. We have to go through with this. And yet this female partner of his, who knows the kind of man that he is now actually volunteering every week at the center to help us to change the laws and change the sexist ways in which the police do their business, so that what happened to her partner doesn't have to happen one day, won't have to happen to other men. And that fills me with a lot of optimism.
But this is a topic that is thrown around a lot in the manosphere. And you hear people saying that, well, the only reason why it's such a good thing that women are joining the men's rights movement, or have always been in the men's rights movement, is that people just simply don't feel sorry for men, period. And this is why we need men in the men's rights movement. But also, this this underscores the fact that people are somehow incapable of caring about what happens to men unless they know them personally, or are relatives with them, or are married to them. And I hear this a lot. If you just give me just a minute, I hear this a lot. But also, I at some point, the sense of fairness must kick in. But also, and this is something I just thought of as you were talking about this, I think men are inured to be scared to publicly fight for their rights. I think that men are, and when you say you have these women who are willing to fight so hard, in your experience, are these women prepared to, or are they outwardly willing to fight harder than the men that they say that they're fighting for? I mean, because I've seen this in the men's rights movement. I've seen women who are just like, no, this is wrong, and they take more action, they take more initiative, and they do so with much more intrepidation than a lot of men do.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. I think what sometimes happens is that the men have been so hurt and are, in some cases, dealing with depression, dealing with PTSD,
yes,
of what they do, that it has to be other people in their life who will champion the cause, or at least will help them to get their foot literally in our door. So I'll give you another example. Just today, it was a busy day at the office, I guess. We had a brother and a sister show up together to our weekly peer support program, which we have for men who are dealing with hardships and emotional difficulties of all kinds. And of course, sometimes it's hard for men to express their feelings, so we have this program that's set up. It's completely non-judgmental, and it's also open to anybody. So even though it's geared to men, we accept women. In fact, it's facilitated by two social service workers, a man and a woman. And at first, some people thought that might be iffy, but I think it was the right call, because one example today, and I could give you other examples, it was actually this man's sister who called me up one day and went into some detail about some anxiety that her brother was suffering from.
Right.
And I talked to her a couple of times before he felt comfortable calling me. She was basically testing the waters. And then he ultimately did call me. We had a very good conversation. He came in today, and I believe he had a good experience. So she opened the door, but he had to walk through it, and he did. So it can't only be women. I'm not suggesting that. But if women can help to open these doors, whether physical doors or metaphorical doors, and then the men can walk through it, hopefully jointly with the women and other people who care about them. I think that strengthens our movement. I really do.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I've said this myself, where one of the biggest problems that we face as a movement is the people that we're representing, the people we're speaking for, are, but by the very nature of the issues we're talking about, they're people who are put at a disadvantage financially, mentally, legally. They're people who are literally on. They're hanging on to the last rung of the ladder, and it's hard to help. People say that men are too prideful, and then there's some people who say, oh, no one cares about men. But I think maybe the biggest thing is that the people that we're speaking for are the most helpless people in society. They're men who have had their children taken away from them. That tears your heart out. They're men who've had all their money taken away from them. They're men who have unfairly been hit with restraining orders and who are in jail. These are by default people who they don't have any resources to give or to offer. The only thing they can offer is their story. And this I think this is has always been and maybe always will be the biggest drag on the movement. Whereas if you talk about the feminist movement, it's been funded by governments all along. There's always been willing corporate and individual donators to all kinds of feminist causes.
Well,
Men's rights causes just don't have that at all. We are the poorest of the poor is when it comes to human rights.
right, and this is why, look, if we can cast a wide net, if we can work with whomever will work with us, whether that's men or women, whether that's people who use the MRA label or some other label, we have enough challenges to deal with, just as you suggested. We don't need to create more challenges, right, by deciding that we're going to limit this movement in some other way that makes it even more difficult for us to progress as those of us who care about men's health issues. Another way in which we're trying to widen that net is we're working with other social service agencies. We're working with a number of, I don't know if they're women's groups or feminist groups necessarily, but they're groups that have been around for a long time and largely have been providing services to women. Groups that deal, for example, with domestic violence, almost exclusively with women. But in fact, a couple of these groups, when we opened up our center, they actually reached out to us. They were really glad that we were there. They're kind of bound by the fact that they get government grants and corporate sponsorships, that they have to focus on women because their funders want that, but they're philosophically very supportive of also helping men. So they're very much open to sharing the resources that they can, whether that's goods and services, whether that's know-how, and in one particular case, it's going to be in the form of a joint sponsorship of a conference, the first conference in Toronto to deal with male survivors of violence and sexual abuse. We're doing that hand in hand with a number of largely women's focused abuse organizations. So again, there are some who I talk to who want to have nothing to do with these other groups or with women or whatever, because they kind of want to narrow things and be really purist about how we conduct ourselves.
Right, yeah.
I take the opposite approach. I think we need to be as broad as we can, and if we find allies in surprising places, we can welcome that.
I haven't had the pleasure of interviewing you in a little while now. I wanted to talk about this billboard that you put on Davenport Road. I guess Davenport Road is a major thoroughfare there in Toronto. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's one of the main arteries into the downtown core. And the billboard is sort of right at Davenport as it's about to enter downtown. It's a pretty busy area.
Okay, great. So, and when did you put it up again?
Well, unfortunately, it's down now. It was up for about 4 weeks. It went up in mid-March, and it was up for about a month thereafter.
Okay, so you only had enough money for a month, I guess, or?
Yes, we did. Now, I should say that this was, so there are 2 more billboards that are in the works, and the next one will be out within a month. I don't know the exact time frame. Another one after that will follow some months later. And the plan is we're busy fundraising and working with our branches to bring this to additional cities. We want to hit at least the cities where we have our active branches by the end of the year.
Right.
Sorry, I seem to have lost the audio.
Looks like Robert may have dropped out. Let me see if I can get him back here. Oh boy. Give me just 1 second. Hopefully he's on his way back in. Sorry about that, folks. We are having some technical difficulties. If you will bear with us for just one moment, we will try to get this taken care of. Ah, there he is.
Yep.
Yep, you're in, Robert?
Yeah, I am.
Okay. Justin, we are...
Sorry about that. I was gonna. For some reason, it said that there was an error, so and I reloaded the page. So I guess, can you hear me? Okay, everybody.
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, I was just gonna ask, what the reaction. I don't know how much you heard of my question, but I was again talking about this billboard that you had on Davenport Road. And I'm looking at the picture, and it shows it says half of domestic violence victims are men. No domestic violence shelters are dedicated to us. I thought that wording was interesting. You said us, so it was a self-identifying type thing. And it said hashtag Let's Talk All Men. Then it says donate to our programs for boys and men. Of course, they have a picture of a woman with an open hand in the back of a guy. The guy's plugging his ears. What were the reactions you got from both the press, from, I guess, maybe local academics and local domestic violence shelters in the area?
Well, that's hard to qualify in a simple response, because
Sure.
there was the one thing that all the responses had in common is people were kind of overwhelmed by the implications of daring to do this.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, it was a bold move. It's like, wow, there's a domestic violence poster where men are featured as the victims. No one's ever done that before.
Not in Toronto, certainly. And so, it did draw a lot of eyebrow raising, and it sparked, I think, a healthy debate. And if you read the pages, the editorial pages, there were certainly people arguing both sides of it. But what was interesting, to get back to our earlier conversation, is nobody refuted the central premise, the two central premises, namely that there's a comparable level of victimization suffered by men as women, and there is this gap in services for male victims. Nobody disputed that. They tried to reorient the conversation in other ways, in other directions, interesting directions, valid directions, talking about maybe men can leave violence easier than women can, maybe men don't suffer as severe violence. Both of those also have certain stereotypes that you need to unpack. So, it got into a lot of interesting terrain. But the central premises that we put up on the billboard, that violence against men is serious, and that there are no places for men to go, that really went, I think, unchallenged. Now, you also asked me about the response from domestic violence shelters. I was quite gratified. Right around the time we put that ad up, we started getting a lot of calls to the Center for Men and Families from a number of other agencies, from hospitals, including the Women's Hospital in Toronto, started referring men to us. We got referrals from, I mentioned earlier, the Center for Abuse Awareness. This is the organization that's partnering with us on that Male Survivors Conference at the end of the year. They started referring people to us. A number of Toronto that deal with families and and violence started referring people to us. So while the public and the media was having this big debate and it turned into kind of an ideological war, the thing that didn't get a lot of attention was the fact that the ad was successful in that people were finally coming out and getting help. And in some cases, these were men who had been suffering in silence for years, and for the first time ever, they were getting help. And to me, that's really all that matters.
That's really, really interesting. Actually, very heartening. So there were a lot of people in the domestic violence industry who are like, hey, this could be a new way to help more people. Who genuinely felt that, right?
Well, there was an interesting divide between the violence against women sort of not researchers, but the ideologues, right? The people who as part of their stock and trade, promote certain ideologies regarding violence against women. So they, of course, didn't even want to have this conversation. This was an inconvenient fact that they wanted to brush aside. But the people that actually run the shelters or run the violence prevention initiatives or run other social service agencies who actually have men knocking on their door looking for help and know that these men do in fact exist, that this isn't a philosophical debate. These are real people. Those frontline workers are the ones who started looking us up and contacting us and referring men to us. So it was really interesting. People were having all these debates. Are these men really out there? Are they out there in the quantities that this billboard suggests? And meanwhile, while all of that was happening, we were helping actual men, the men who, according to some people, don't exist.
Yeah. Men were actually coming in, and well, because they were being encouraged to do so, was that they found there was a place to go.
That's exactly.
Interesting. You mentioned something about how a debate was started about some people were asking that perhaps it's easier for men to leave domestic violence situations, therefore it doesn't affect them as much. That kind of stuck out. I kind of wanted to bring it up again because it seems to me, and I've heard this a lot in my through the years I've been doing this and talking about this and been talking to people about this and asking questions about it. I've known of a lot of men who stayed in incredibly caustically abusive relationships because they thought that if they were to leave, they would never see their kids again.
Exactly.
Was that ever brought up as a possible return to that argument that men would find it easier to leave? Now, it's certainly if you're a single guy, or if you don't have any kids. Personally, I don't understand why anybody would say that it's harder for a woman to leave an abusive relationship than it is for a man. I never understood that one, but
no, I mean, it turns out, shocking to some people, that men and women actually aren't that different.
Yeah.
Reasons why women often don't leave abusive relationships are similar to the reasons that men give for not leaving abusive relationships. Financial dependency, a commitment to the relationship, sometimes religious community that frowns upon breakup of marriage. And on top of that, there's a unique reason for men, and it's one you just referred to. Men are more likely to never see their children again if they leave the house, if they break up their relationship. So, or at least it'll be much harder for them to maintain a loving relationship with their children as compared to a woman in that situation. So there are all the same reasons and more for why men may stay. And in fact, again, I know now from personal anecdotes that I've heard, men do stay in abusive relationships for years and years and years, and they have nowhere to go, nobody to talk to, nobody who believes them half the time that they're dealing with trauma and violence.
Right. Well, there's no support. There's no one they can go to even give them a sympathetic ear, and that's a huge part of leaving an abusive relationship, is being able to go to someone and say, hey, I'm with this person, and they're doing this to me, and they're saying that, then they're throwing things at me and this and that. It's so much harder for a guy to find a sympathetic ear in that case than it is for a woman. I can't tell you how many guys I know who've told me this story where like they when they told their friends and they were laughed at, and they and then they just shut down. They didn't talk about it, and they they became alcoholics, or they started using drugs or whatever, or they became severely depressed, and this compounded the problem.
Well, look, we know that men tend to have a smaller sort of social network to draw on,
Right.
And in addition to that, the government and our social institutions don't provide anywhere near the same levels of social support. And at the most extreme end of this, this is a contributing factor as to why men are more likely to kill themselves than women are. We know that suicide is sort of the last desperate act when you think that there's nowhere left for you to turn.
It's an active.
So fewer friends, smaller social network, no social services available to you. It's more likely that you're going to feel as though there's nothing for you and no way to get out of the deep depression that you have found yourself in.
Right. Suicide is an act of not necessarily of depression, but of complete hopelessness, where you felt you've reached the end of your rope and there's no reason to go on anymore. That's Well, let's talk about.
True.
We could, and this is one of the things that a huge men's rights issue, and an issue that I know that Cafe talks about a lot. Since we're talking about is male suicide. This is I believe the product of so many things, not the least of which, and maybe most importantly, is the fact that there is very little, almost next to no, social support for men as men who need social support, until just recently with groups like yours and a very small handful of others. And this is here in this country, and I know this is true in India. I know it's true in the UK as well. Not sure about Canada, but I strongly suspect it's the same way. That starting in the early 70s with the no-fault divorce revolution, of course it was different in other parts of the world, that male suicide rates in comparison to women just started skyrocketing. It was up until 1971 in this country, men were never more than twice as likely to kill themselves as women, and in 1928 it was about the same. But starting in 1971, male suicide rates just started going through the roof. Now men are 5 times as likely to commit suicide as women are, and I suspect it's more or less the same way there in Canada. But no one's ever talked about this. No one ever brings this up, and there's never been any study concerning this. As an organization, what has Cafe done to address this problem? And I know that you have addressed it, but could you just kind of like expand on
Sure.
that?
Yeah, and that's actually an area of research that we're desperately looking for statistics, is that correlation between family break and male suicide. Just as you said, that there's a connection, but when they study suicide, they don't usually account for the motives. I mean, often the motives are complicated, they're not clear-cut, but I don't know that there's been a lot of research to try to understand the connection, in particular, between family breakup and suicide, and how that affects fathers disproportionately. So that's a project that we'd like to get into, but that's difficult, and we'll take some time to develop. But what I would say is that we tackle suicide head on by looking at by researching the issue, but we also tackle it by providing support for all of the issues which may be contributing factors. And we know that in so many ways, whether it's job prospects, whether it's educational attainment, whether it's support for mental health issues or addiction issues or homeless issues, men are disproportionately more likely to be suffering in all of these areas, and men are not doing as well as women, I dare say, in terms of adjusting to the realities of a changing society, whether that's, again, education and workforce. And we deal with all of those areas. We have employment counseling, we have peer support, we have one-on-one therapy. I should say what we do is extremely modest. We're only able to help a couple dozen men on a weekly basis. Let's say we don't have sophisticated programs, we don't have a lot of staff. What we're really trying to do is establish some precedents, establish sort of a model for how this can work. And then our hope is that this can be taken, this model, and emulated by other agencies in Toronto, in Ottawa, and across Canada and beyond. This is really to show sort of proof of concept, to demonstrate what a men's center, a thriving men's center, could look like. And so we're trying to tackle a whole bunch of issues which are directly or indirectly related to suicide and the sort of the most extreme consequence of what can happen to men when the social supports are lacking.
Well, I mean, it seems like just talking about it and pointing it out is the single biggest thing at this point, because you never hear about this really serious phenomenon that's been going on for the past 40 years. No one ever talks about it. No one's ever even cared to do a study about it, but it's a huge, huge deal. I mean, no one ever talks about it. It's just it's like the thing that no one ever. It's like the.
I agree completely.
Yeah, I mean, it's the 800.
It's the elephant in the room.
I was about to say 800-pound gorilla in the room, but it is definitely that big animal in the room that no one wants to talk about because it's so serious. Because we're talking about human beings taking their own lives. Whenever a human being takes their own life, or there's an increase in human beings taking their own lives, something serious is going on. But in this particular case, so few people are even talking about it. It's an amazing. It's something that's so worth talking about and so worth mentioning, I think.
Well, again, to go back full circle, public education and consciousness raising and awareness. This is why that has always been at the core, and I think will remain at the core of our program. We branch out in different parts of Canada. That will be the first thing that we do, is we get the conversations going, because I think you're right. That can be a great leveraging. It can actually help people, individuals who are suffering, but by getting a conversation going, you don't know what you'll spark, right? You might get other agencies interested in providing services to men. You might get some politicians one day willing to champion these issues. I think it'll be the last, because politicians are the most conservative of all elements of society, but who knows, it might happen. But once you get conversations going, you don't know where they're going to go, and I think that's an exciting thing.
Yeah, well, this is another thing, and again, I want to expand on this a bit more. There are a lot of people who say that just talking about it is just you're not going to do anything. That this is really you're pissing into a hurricane or whatever. It's not going to make any difference. But you guys have proven that just presenting yourselves, things can happen. Big things can start to happen. And now, what would you say to people who? And I talk to these people all the time that say, oh, society doesn't care about men. It's not even worth trying to go down an activism tact in which you try to make your case. That's all very futile because the feminists will come and eat you alive if you try to do so. And beyond all that, people just don't care about men at all. What do you have to say to those people who say that?
I would invite them to come to the Canadian Centre for Men and see the actual, tangible, measurable programs that we're providing, helping, one time, and then by strengthening that man, strengthening his family, and ultimately strengthening our communities and our societies. So for us, it's always been a combination of two things: getting the conversations going, but at the same time having a long-term plan. Once those conversations are starting, what do we do? How do we build on that momentum? Whether it's opening up a center and providing services, whether it's creating a public policy arm that tries to lobby for improvements in policies as they affect men and boys. So it's got to be a bit of both. You got to start those conversations, but you got to also find creative ways of building those into change that can really make a difference in our society.
Well, I don't think I have any more questions for you tonight. I really don't. It's been an hour. Yeah, normally we go for about an hour and a half, but this has been you're always such a productive interviewee. You're very always on the ball with everything. And again, it's just tremendous to have you on the show every time. I see Cafe as one of those organizations that really is an example of a successful organization that deals with men's issues.
Well, in large part thanks to the community. And I mean that very broadly speaking. We have allies in all sorts of interesting places, and we're very thankful for that. I think that's been, one of the contributors to our success. I would love to get onto your show, perhaps instead of my coming back on next time, although I'm happy to come back, getting on some of the people that provide some of the services to maybe talk about, what helping men, give you some ideas of some of the stories that they've been hearing. Because I think, it's good to hear about some of the horrendous things people are going through just to understand those experiences. But I think there's also some uplifting stories too that your listeners might benefit from hearing.
I think we could make a series out of that. Actually, I would be very interested in talking with you further about that. Perfect. Let's definitely, because oftentimes we're kind of, we can't always find a guest for the show, but I love that idea, finding people to talk about success stories and sharing their stories with us, because I think there's not enough of that, I think unfortunately that leads to way too much nihilism in our movement, way too much.
I do agree with you on that.
Yes, way too much. But anyway, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you being here with us. It's a little bit after 10 o'clock right now. I do have an engagement to go to. It's my birthday tonight, and some friends are going to go buy me a couple of drinks. So I'm going to cut the show.
Happy birthday, and it's a pleasure to join.
That's okay. I'm just saying, maybe I'm just looking for an excuse to get out of here, but really I'm not. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you, and I hope to meet you in person someday, actually. Maybe someday you'll be lucky enough to do that. But otherwise, let's keep in touch about getting you on the show again and getting some of your friends on the show to talk about what we just mentioned.
Sounds like a good plan. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much, Justin.
Bye,
James, do we have any final advice for the audience?
Yes, we do, folks. Take the red pill.